I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
There are evenings when London wraps itself in fog like a lady donning her finest shawl, and there are evenings when the city seems to hold its breath in anticipation of events yet unborn. The night of November 15th was decidedly of the latter variety, with a peculiar stillness that made even the most prosaic soul pause and listen for footsteps that might not come. I found myself at Grosvenor House that evening through one of those social obligations that, while pleasant enough in prospect, often prove more significant in retrospect than one could possibly imagine. Lady Pemberton, my late wife's cousin, had extended what she termed a small, intimate gathering to discuss her latest philanthropic venture, the establishment of a home for retired governesses. The cause was worthy, the company select, and the prospect of Lady Pemberton's excellent cook made acceptance inevitable. Grosvenor House stood in dignified splendor on its corner of Mayfair, its Georgian facade glowing warmly against the November chill. The drawing-room, when I arrived precisely at 7:30, presented that perfect tableau of English refinement: crystal decanters catching the lamplight, fresh chrysanthemums arranged with mathematical precision, and a fire crackling with a sort of well-bred enthusiasm that only the finest coal can provide. Lady Pemberton herself, a woman of 60 whose steel-grey hair and ramrod posture suggested a lifetime of committee work and charitable endeavors, greeted me with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing both people and causes with equal facility. "Captain Hastings," she said, extending a gloved hand. "How good of you to come. I believe you know most everyone, though we have one or two new faces this evening." Indeed, the gathering was pleasantly familiar. There was Sir Reginald Thornfield, the retired colonial administrator whose stories of India never failed to entertain; Mrs. Adelaide Fairfax, the widow of a tea merchant whose sharp wit was matched only by her sharper tongue; and Dr. Marcus Whitmore, the family physician whose calm demeanor and thoughtful observations had made him a trusted confidant to half of London society. The new faces proved equally intriguing. Miss Lydia Ashford, Lady Pemberton's recently appointed secretary, was a young woman of perhaps 28, whose quiet efficiency masked what I suspected was a formidable intelligence. Her dark hair was swept back in a severe chignon, and her grey eyes held the sort of alertness one associates with those who make their living by observing others. Mr. James Blackwood, introduced as Lady Pemberton's financial adviser, was a man of middle years whose prosperous appearance spoke of successful investments and careful planning. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine, though I noticed he had the habit of glancing frequently toward the windows as if expecting someone. The final member of our party was perhaps the most intriguing, Professor Artemis Crane, a distinguished archaeologist recently returned from Egypt. His weathered face and penetrating dark eyes spoke of years spent under foreign suns, and his conversation, when he chose to contribute, revealed a mind both scholarly and surprisingly practical. There was something about his manner, however, a watchfulness that seemed at odds with the social nature of the gathering, that suggested he carried burdens beyond mere academic concerns. Conversation flowed smoothly through the first hour, touching upon the usual subjects: the unseasonably mild weather, the latest political developments, and the professor's fascinating discoveries in the Valley of the Kings. Lady Pemberton proved an accomplished hostess, drawing out each guest's expertise while maintaining the delicate balance between information and entertainment that marks truly successful social discourse. It was at precisely 8:45. I remember checking my watch as the grandfather clock in the hallway began its measured chimes, that we heard the first sequence. 3 knocks, deliberate and evenly spaced, echoing from somewhere deep within the house. The sound was neither urgent nor tentative, but carried instead a quality of absolute certainty that made every conversation pause. "How curious," Lady Pemberton murmured, setting down her sherry glass. Morrison should have answered immediately. But Morrison, the elderly butler whose service to the household spanned 3 decades, did not appear. Instead, after a moment's silence, the knocking came again. 3 measured raps, identical in rhythm and intensity to the first. This time, the sound seemed to resonate through the very walls of the house, as if whoever stood outside possessed an intimate knowledge of the building's acoustics. Professor Crane straightened in his chair, his dark eyes suddenly alert. "That rhythm," he said quietly, almost to himself. 3 beats, 5-second intervals. It's quite specific. Before anyone could respond, the sequence repeated a 3rd time. 3 knocks, precisely spaced, followed by a silence that seemed to stretch far beyond its actual duration. Then, from somewhere in the depths of the house, came the sound of a door opening, followed by footsteps. Not Morrison's familiar shuffle, but something lighter, more purposeful. Miss Ashford rose gracefully from her chair. "Perhaps I should see—" "No need, my dear," Lady Pemberton interrupted, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there moments before. "Morrison will manage. He always does." But Morrison did not appear, and the footsteps, after a few moments, ceased entirely. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the clock and the soft hiss of coal settling in the grate. I found myself studying the faces around me, noting the subtle changes that the mysterious knocking had wrought. Sir Reginald's jovial expression had tightened into something more guarded. Mrs. Fairfax's sharp eyes darted repeatedly toward the drawing-room doors. Dr. Whitmore sat very still, his medical training perhaps alerting him to tensions that others might miss. It was Mr. Blackwood who finally broke the silence. "Lady Pemberton," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Perhaps we should—" He was interrupted by Miss Ashford's sudden intake of breath. She stood frozen near the window, her face pale, one hand pressed to her throat. "The garden," she whispered. "There's someone in the garden." We all turned toward the French windows that opened onto Lady Pemberton's prized rose garden. The glass reflected our own lamplight, making it difficult to see beyond, but as our eyes adjusted, a figure became visible among the bare rose bushes. A tall, thin silhouette that seemed to be watching the house with patient intensity. Professor Crane moved swiftly to the window and peered out. After a moment, he stepped back, his expression troubled. "There's no one there now," he said quietly. "But the ground near the terrace shows clear footprints. Someone was definitely watching us." Lady Pemberton's composure, which had remained admirably intact throughout the evening's strange events, finally showed signs of strain. "This is most irregular," she said, her voice sharp with annoyance, and, I suspected, a touch of fear. "I shall speak to Morrison immediately about—" She was interrupted by a commotion from the hallway, hurried footsteps, a woman's cry, and then Morrison's voice, raised in alarm. My lady, come quickly!" We rushed from the drawing-room to find Morrison standing at the foot of the main staircase, his usually imperturbable demeanor completely shattered. His face was ashen, his hands trembling as he pointed toward the upper floor. "It's Professor Crane's room, my lady," he stammered. "The door was locked from the inside, but when I used the master key— Oh, my lady, it's terrible." But Professor Crane was standing beside me in the hallway, very much alive and unharmed. The confusion on Morrison's face was almost comical as he stared at the man he had apparently expected to find dead. "Not Professor Crane, Morrison," Lady Pemberton said with growing alarm. "Then who—" The answer came as we reached the landing of the first floor. The door to what I now realized was the guest room stood open, revealing a scene that would be forever etched in my memory. A man lay sprawled across the Persian carpet, his evening clothes immaculate except for the spreading stain of crimson that marked his chest. A letter opener, one I recognized from Lady Pemberton's writing desk downstairs, protruded from between his ribs with surgical precision. The victim was a stranger to all of us, yet his presence in the house was somehow not surprising. He was a man of perhaps 50, well-dressed but not expensively so, with the sort of unremarkable features that would make him easily forgettable in a crowd. In his right hand, he clutched a small white card, and on the nightstand beside the bed lay an opened envelope bearing Lady Pemberton's name in elegant script. Dr. Eyes. Whitmore immediately knelt beside the body, his professional instincts overriding the shock of discovery. After a brief examination, he looked up gravely. "He's been dead for perhaps 20 minutes, he announced. "The wound is precise, almost surgical. Death would have been nearly instantaneous." Miss Ashford, who had followed us upstairs despite Lady Pemberton's protests, moved to examine the card in the dead man's hand. With careful fingers, she extracted it and held it up to the light. It bore no name, no message. Only 3 Roman numerals printed in black ink. Through. The connection was immediate and chilling. 3 knocks at the door, 3 repetitions of the sequence, and now 3 numerals clutched in a dead man's hand. Someone had orchestrated this evening's events with theatrical precision, and we had all been unwitting players in their deadly drama. "The envelope," Lady Pemberton said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does it say?" Miss Ashford carefully opened the already torn envelope and withdrew a single sheet of cream-colored paper. Her face grew even paler as she read the contents, and when she looked up, her eyes held a mixture of fear and confusion. "It's addressed to you, Lady Pemberton," she said slowly. "It says, 'The debt must be paid. The past cannot remain buried forever. Tonight, justice comes knocking thrice.'" The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of rain beginning to fall against the windows. Each of us stood frozen in that tableau of death and mystery, trying to comprehend how an evening of charitable discussion had transformed into something far more sinister. As I looked around at the faces of my fellow guests, I realized that the stranger's death was only the beginning. Someone among us, or someone who knew us well enough to orchestrate this elaborate scene, had committed murder. The 3 knocks had been a signal, a warning, or perhaps a calling card. But whose and why? It was then, standing in that room with its terrible burden of death and unanswered questions, that I thought of my friend Hercule Poirot. His methodical mind and psychological insight would be invaluable in unraveling this web of mystery. The local police would undoubtedly do their duty, but this case demanded something more, the unique genius of the little Belgian detective who saw patterns where others saw only chaos. As if reading my thoughts, Lady Pemberton turned to me with desperate eyes. "Captain Hastings," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "You have connections with that detective fellow, don't you? The Belgian. I believe we shall need someone of exceptional ability to solve this puzzle." Indeed we would. For as I stood there, looking down at the stranger who had knocked thrice and paid the ultimate price for his mysterious errand, I knew that this was merely the opening movement of a symphony that would test even Poirot's remarkable powers of deduction. The game, as my friend would say, was afoot. The rain that had begun as a gentle pattering against the windows now drummed with increasing intensity, as if the very heavens sought to wash away the evening's dark turn. I found myself automatically checking my pocket watch, 9:15 precisely, a habit born from years of military service and reinforced by my association with Poirot, who insisted that time was often the most crucial element in any investigation. Lady Pemberton had taken charge with admirable composure, her aristocratic breeding serving her well in this moment of crisis. She directed Morrison to telephone both the police and, at my suggestion, to prepare for additional guests who might arrive to assist with the investigation. The elderly butler, still visibly shaken by his grim discovery, moved with the mechanical precision of a man performing familiar duties while his mind struggled to process the extraordinary circumstances. As we descended the staircase, I noticed Professor Crane lagging behind, his weathered face deeply troubled. When I paused to allow him to catch up, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Captain Hastings, that message about debts and the past remaining buried, it troubles me greatly." His dark eyes searched mine with an intensity that suggested he knew more than he was revealing. In my line of work, one encounters many secrets that powerful people would prefer to keep hidden. Ancient artifacts have a way of carrying modern consequences. His words sent a chill through me, for they suggested that this crime might have roots extending far beyond the confines of Grosvenor House. Before I could press him for details, Mrs. Fairfax appeared at his elbow, her sharp features animated with the sort of morbid excitement that some people display in the face of tragedy. "Professor, surely you don't believe this has anything to do with your archaeological work," she said, though her voice carried an edge of nervous energy. The poor man was clearly some sort of blackmailer or confidence trickster. These things happen in the best families, you know. Her words, though callously delivered, contained a grain of uncomfortable truth. The victim's appearance and manner of dress had indeed suggested someone who moved on the fringes of respectable society, the sort of individual who might traffic in secrets and compromising information. Yet something about the theatrical nature of his arrival and death suggested a more complex motive than simple extortion. In the drawing room, we arranged ourselves with the same careful attention to propriety that had marked the earlier part of the evening, though the comfortable atmosphere had been replaced by an electric tension that made every small sound seem magnified. Miss Ashford busied herself with unnecessary tidying, her movements sharp and precise, while Mr. Blackwood stood by the window, periodically checking his watch with obvious anxiety. His earlier glances toward the garden now seemed to carry additional significance, and I found myself wondering what he might have expected to see there. Sir Reginald, who had remained remarkably quiet since the discovery of the body, finally broke the uncomfortable silence with a question that had been troubling me as well. "Lady Pemberton, forgive my directness, but have you any idea who that unfortunate fellow might have been? His presence in your house suggests some prior connection, however indirect." Lady Pemberton's response was immediate and emphatic, perhaps too much so. "I've never seen that man before in my life, Sir Reginald. His presence here is as much a mystery to me as it is to all of you." She paused, her fingers working nervously at the pearls around her throat. Though I must admit, the message he carried suggests otherwise. Someone believes I owe a debt, but to whom and for what, I cannot fathom. Dr. Whitmore, who had been examining his hands with the careful attention of a man accustomed to washing away evidence of mortality, looked up with a thoughtful expression that carried professional weight. "The precision of the wound troubles me greatly," he said quietly. "This was not the work of someone acting in passion or panic. The angle, the depth, the placement, it suggests someone with anatomical knowledge, or at least considerable experience with edged weapons." This observation sent a visible chill through the assembled company, for it implied that the murderer possessed not only the cunning to orchestrate an elaborate deception, but also the skill to kill with surgical efficiency. I found myself studying each face in turn, wondering which of these seemingly respectable individuals might harbor such dark capabilities, or whether we were dealing with an outsider who had somehow gained access to the house. The arrival of Inspector Bradley of Scotland Yard provided a welcome interruption to these increasingly uncomfortable reflections. Bradley was a competent officer whom I had encountered during several of Poirot's previous cases. Methodical, thorough, and possessed of enough sense to recognize when a situation required expertise beyond his own considerable abilities. His solid presence and no-nonsense manner brought a semblance of official order to the chaos that had engulfed the evening. After examining the scene upstairs with meticulous care and taking preliminary statements from each of us, Bradley returned to the drawing room with the sort of expression that suggested he was already feeling the weight of the case's complexity. The victim, he informed us, carried no identification beyond a railway ticket stub from Dover, suggesting he had arrived in London only that morning. The letter opener, he confirmed, belonged to Lady Pemberton's writing desk, though when it had been removed, and by whom, remained a mystery. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bradley announced with the gravity befitting the circumstances, "I'm afraid I must ask you all to remain available for further questioning over the next few days. This is clearly a case that will require considerable investigation." He paused, his experienced eyes finding mine across the room. "Captain Hastings, I don't suppose your friend Monsieur Poirot might be available to assist with this matter? The circumstances are rather more complex than usual, and his particular methods might prove invaluable." I assured him that I would contact Poirot first thing in the morning, though privately I suspected that my friend's involvement would prove not merely helpful, but absolutely essential. The theatrical nature of the crime, the mysterious message, the locked room, and the closed circle of suspects all bore the hallmarks of the sort of puzzle that Poirot found irresistible. His methodical mind and psychological insight would be crucial in unraveling the web of deception that someone had so carefully constructed. As the evening finally drew to its somber close and the guests prepared to depart under police escort to their respective homes, I realized that none of us would sleep easily that night. Somewhere among us, or connected to us in ways we had yet to understand, was someone capable of orchestrating murder with the precision of a master dramatist. The stranger had knocked thrice, delivered his cryptic message of justice and buried debts, and paid with his life. But his death was clearly only the opening act in a far more complex and dangerous drama that was yet to unfold. The game, as Poirot would say, was indeed afoot, and I found myself both dreading and anticipating the moment when his keen intellect would begin to illuminate the dark corners of this most perplexing mystery. The grey London dawn brought little respite from the previous evening's horrors, and I found myself at the telephone in Lady Pemberton's study by 8 o'clock, my hand trembling slightly as I dialed the familiar number of Whitehaven Mansions. Poirot's voice, when it came through the crackling line, carried its customary precision despite the early hour. "Ah, Hastings, mon ami. From your tone, I perceive that the social evening you mentioned has taken a most sinister turn." Without preamble, I related the night's events, from the mysterious 3 knocks to the discovery of the stranger's body. Poirot listened in characteristic silence, interrupted only by the soft scratch of his pen making notes. "Most intriguing," he murmured when I finished. "A theatrical crime, yet executed with surgical precision. I shall come immediately." Within the hour, a black taxi deposited my friend at Grosvenor House's imposing entrance. His small, precise figure emerged immaculately dressed, despite the early summons, his green eyes already surveying the Georgian facade with that peculiar intensity that missed nothing. Lady Pemberton, pale but composed, greeted him in the morning room with the desperate courtesy of someone grasping at salvation. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings has spoken of your remarkable abilities. I confess myself completely bewildered by what has occurred in my own home." Poirot bowed with old-world gallantry, his sharp gaze studying her face with clinical precision. "Madame, you must not distress yourself. The truth, she has a way of revealing herself to those who know how to look. But first, I must examine the scene with the thoroughness that such a puzzle demands." Inspector Bradley, who had returned with additional officers, led us to the guest room where the tragedy had unfolded. The body had been removed, but the room remained sealed, preserving the tableau of death. Poirot moved through the space like a conductor studying a complex score, his eyes cataloguing every detail with methodical precision. At the writing desk by the window, he paused, his head tilted at that characteristic angle indicating deep concentration. "Inspector, you mentioned the victim carried a railway ticket from Dover. Most illuminating. This leather satchel found in the room?" Bradley consulted his notebook carefully. "Empty when we found it, but the leather showed clear impressions suggesting it had contained documents of some kind. Whatever he brought from Dover was removed before or after his death." "Ah, So our mysterious visitor carried information that someone considered worth killing for. Poirot's fingers drummed against his lips thoughtfully. Yet the message speaks of personal debts and buried secrets. We have here two motives intertwining, the practical and the emotional. He moved to examine the room's acoustics, tapping his cane against the paneled wall. The sound resonated through the house with that same peculiar quality I remembered from the evening before. Architecture has its own voice, Hastings. Those familiar with a building can make it speak in ways that mystify others. Lady Pemberton, who had been following our investigation with growing agitation, spoke with forced conviction. I must emphasize again, Monsieur Poirot, that I have no connection whatsoever to Dover, nor can I imagine what debt this person believed I owed. But even as she protested, I noticed the slight tremor in her voice and the way her hands worried at her pearls. Poirot, I was certain, observed these telltale signs as well, for his expression carried that patient skepticism he reserved for statements requiring further investigation. Of course, madame. Yet in my experience, the past has a persistent way of demanding payment in the present. He turned to Inspector Bradley. I shall need to interview each guest from last evening. Someone orchestrated these events with intimate knowledge of your household routines and access to your personal effects. The implication hung heavy in the morning air, that the murderer was not some unknown intruder, but someone who had sat among the respectable gathering, making polite conversation while planning cold-blooded murder. As we prepared to begin the interviews, Poirot paused at the threshold, his gaze fixed on some invisible patterns only he could perceive. The stranger knocked thrice, Hastings, but I suspect those 3 knocks were merely the final movement in a symphony that began playing long ago. Someone has been very clever, very patient, and very dangerous. Now we must discover who among our cast of characters possesses such deadly theatrical flair. The hunt for truth was beginning in earnest, and I felt that familiar mixture of anticipation and apprehension that always accompanied the early stages of Poirot's most challenging cases. The morning interviews commenced in Lady Pemberton's sun-dappled morning room, where Poirot had arranged the furniture with mathematical precision. Each chair was positioned to afford him optimal observation of facial expressions, nervous gestures, and those telltale signs that often betray guilt more effectively than any verbal confession. Inspector Bradley sat quietly in the corner, his notebook ready, while I positioned myself near the window where the pale November light would illuminate our subjects' faces. Morrison entered first, his elderly frame bearing the weight of 30 years' faithful service and one night's terrible shock. His hands, I noticed, still trembled slightly as he smoothed his livery, and his usual impeccable composure had been replaced by the mechanical movements of a man performing familiar duties, while his mind struggled to process extraordinary circumstances. Morrison, Poirot began gently, his tone carrying that peculiar combination of authority and compassion that put even the most nervous witnesses at ease. You have served this household with distinction. Your observations will be invaluable in understanding last evening's events. Tell me, with precision, your movements from 7 o'clock onward. The butler's response was methodical, delivered in the clipped tones of someone accustomed to reporting household matters with accuracy. Dinner had been served at 7 precisely. At 8:15, he had carried the Evening Post to Lady Pemberton's study. From 8:20 until the mysterious knocking began, he had been in the pantry, conducting his weekly audit of the wine ledger, a task that required his complete attention and could account for his failure to hear the front door. The knocking, Morrison. You heard it clearly from the pantry. Poirot's question carried subtle emphasis, and I saw his green eyes narrow slightly as he awaited the response. Indeed, sir. 3 knocks, measured and deliberate, seeming to travel through the very walls of the house. Most peculiar, sir. In all my years of service, I've never heard anything quite like it. Morrison paused, his weathered face troubled. The guest room where the poor gentleman was found, It had been prepared for Professor Crane, as per Lady Pemberton's instructions. This detail struck me as significant, and I saw Poirot make a careful note. The victim had died in a room intended for another guest, suggesting either mistaken identity or deliberate choice of location for symbolic reasons. The keys, Morrison. Tell me about the household keys. Poirot's tone remained conversational, but I sensed the importance he placed on this particular line of inquiry. The butler's response revealed a crucial detail. While he maintained the master key on his personal chain, a duplicate had been cut several months earlier when the original was temporarily mislaid. This duplicate, he admitted with obvious discomfort, was kept in Lady Pemberton's desk drawer for emergencies, a location accessible to anyone familiar with the household's routines. Miss Ashford followed, her dark hair still swept back in that severe chignon, though her usual composure showed signs of strain. Her grey eyes, sharp with intelligence, met Poirot's gaze directly as she settled into the appointed chair. Her testimony proved equally illuminating, delivered with the precision of someone accustomed to managing details. Miss Ashford, you mentioned refreshing the blotting paper in the drawing room. At what time, precisely, did this occur? Poirot's question seemed innocuous, but I recognized the careful way he was establishing a timeline for the letter opener's disappearance. At 8:15, Monsieur Poirot. The letter opener was in its usual place on the writing desk at that time. When I returned at 8:30 to ensure the fire was properly tended, it had vanished. I assumed Lady Pemberton had taken it for some correspondence. Her voice carried a slight tremor as she added, I never imagined it would be used for such a terrible purpose. Poirot studied her ink-stained fingers with interest, noting the evidence of her secretarial duties. The envelope found upstairs. You recognize the stationery as belonging to this household? Indeed, sir. It was from Lady Pemberton's personal supply, kept in the study. However, the handwriting was not hers. I would recognize her script anywhere. Miss Ashford's response was firm, though her hands betrayed her nervousness by twisting in her lap. Mr. Blackwood entered with a composed smile that failed entirely to reach his eyes. His prosperous appearance and careful grooming could not disguise the tension that radiated from his every movement. Throughout the previous evening, his frequent glances toward the garden had struck me as peculiar, and now, under Poirot's penetrating gaze, his discomfort became even more apparent. Mr. Blackwood, your telephone call to your clerk. This occurred at what time? Poirot's question was delivered with casual precision, but I noticed how closely he watched for the man's reaction. 20 minutes past 8, Monsieur Poirot. A matter of some urgency regarding a Paris cable. Blackwood's response came too quickly, with the rehearsed quality of a prepared alibi. Morrison can confirm that I passed through the hall during that time. Ah, yes, most convenient. And your preoccupation with the garden windows, you mentioned this was merely habit? Poirot's tone carried just enough skepticism to make Blackwood shift uncomfortably in his chair. I dislike sitting with my back to glass, particularly at ground level. A quirk of temperament, nothing more. But even as he spoke, I noticed a small detail that Poirot had undoubtedly observed as well. A grain of pale grit lodged in the weave of his cuff, the sort of material one might pick up from walking on wet gravel. Dr. Whitmore brought his professional composure to the interview, though I detected subtle signs of strain beneath his calm exterior. His medical expertise made his observations particularly valuable, and Poirot questioned him with the respect due to a fellow professional. Doctor, your examination of the wound, you maintain that death occurred at approximately 25 minutes past 8. Poirot's question sought confirmation of a crucial timeline element. Indeed, Monsieur Poirot. The precision of the wound was remarkable. Minimal external bleeding, maximum internal damage. Either the killer possessed anatomical knowledge or considerable experience with edged weapons. Dr. Whitmore paused, his professional instincts overriding social discomfort. I also detected a faint aromatic scent about the body. Not medical carbolic, but rather a lavender preparation such as might be used to mask other odors. This detail caused Poirot's eyes to flick briefly toward Lady Pemberton's writing desk, where I recalled seeing a small crystal bottle among her personal effects. The significance was not lost on me, though Poirot's expression remained carefully neutral. As the morning progressed through interviews with Sir Reginald, Mrs. Fairfax, and Professor Crane, a complex pattern began to emerge. Each suspect possessed both motive and opportunity, yet each also provided details that seemed to eliminate them from suspicion. Sir Reginald's military background and colonial service had exposed him to situations involving valuable artifacts. Mrs. Fairfax revealed knowledge of anonymous letters that had been troubling their social circle. Professor Crane's archaeological work had attracted the attention of unscrupulous collectors and dealers. Most significantly, Mrs. Fairfax mentioned observing what she described as an earnest conversation between Mr. Blackwood and Miss Ashford near the staircase before dinner, a detail that added another layer of complexity to the already intricate web of relationships and possible motives. By noon, Poirot had assembled a comprehensive picture of the evening's events, though the solution remained tantalizingly out of reach. The precision of the crime, the symbolic elements of the 3 knocks and the cryptic message, and the intimate knowledge of household routines all pointed to careful planning by someone with access to both the house and detailed information about its occupants. As we prepared to adjourn for lunch, Poirot sat in thoughtful silence, his fingers drumming against his lips in that characteristic gesture indicating deep concentration. The morning's interviews had provided numerous clues and revealed multiple possible motives, but the true pattern remained hidden beneath layers of deception and misdirection. "Hastings," he said finally, his voice carrying that note of satisfaction that indicated progress. "We have learned much this morning. The killer is clever, methodical, and possessed of considerable nerve. But cleverness, mon ami, often contains the seeds of its own destruction. Someone has been very careful to create the perfect crime. But perfection, she has a way of revealing herself to those who know how to look." The investigation was far from over, but I sensed that my friend had begun to perceive the underlying structure of the mystery. The stranger who had knocked thrice was dead, but his message of buried debts and demanded justice was only beginning to reveal its true meaning. After a light luncheon that none of us consumed with much appetite, Poirot requested access to Lady Pemberton's study, where the morning's interviews had suggested several crucial pieces of evidence awaited examination. The room, with its mahogany furnishings and leather-bound volumes, bore the accumulated dignity of decades, yet Poirot's trained eye immediately detected subtle signs of recent disturbance. He moved first to the writing desk, his precise fingers hovering over the brass handles of the drawers without actually touching them. "Inspector Bradley, you mentioned the duplicate key was kept here." At Bradley's confirmation, Poirot carefully opened the right-hand drawer using his handkerchief. The key lay upon a cream-colored blotter, and even from my position near the window I could see the faint smudges upon its surface. "It has been handled recently," Poirot observed, leaning closer to examine the metal without disturbing it. "Note, Hastings, the slight displacement of dust around its usual resting place, and this most interesting detail." He indicated a small crystal bottle nearby, its stopper slightly askew. When he carefully lifted it, the air filled with the distinctive scent of lavender. Lady Pemberton, who had been watching our examination with barely concealed anxiety, offered an explanation that seemed almost too readily prepared. "Miss Ashford insists upon keeping sachets throughout the house. She abhors stale cabinet odors and maintains that correspondence should be pleasantly scented." Her voice carried a slight tremor that suggested this domestic detail held more significance than she cared to admit. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his green eyes cataloguing every nuance of her response. He turned his attention to the pigeonholes containing her personal stationery, noting immediately that one section was minutely out of alignment. drawing forth a single sheet with careful precision. He examined the beveled edge where a letter opener would naturally slide. "Order disturbed by hands that hurry," he murmured, more to himself than to us. But whose hurry, and for what purpose? Inspector Bradley chose this moment to rejoin us, his expression carrying the satisfaction of significant discovery. "Monsieur Poirot, we've identified the victim, one Albert Thornley, age 52, formerly employed as a clerk in various Dover shipping offices. His lodgings contained extensive correspondence suggesting he made his living through what his landlady described, rather bluntly, as blackmail." This revelation caused Lady Pemberton to sink into the nearest chair, her composed facade finally showing cracks of genuine distress. "A blackmailer," she whispered, as if the word itself carried contamination. "But I assure you, gentlemen, I have never had any dealings with such a person." "Perhaps not directly, madame," Poirot replied gently, "but Monsieur Thornley's presence here suggests he believed otherwise. What is most intriguing, however, is what we discovered among his effects." Bradley produced a small evidence envelope containing what appeared to be a business card, slightly crumpled but still legible. The card bore Mr. James Blackwood's name and London office address, but more significantly, someone had scrawled a message on its reverse in hasty script: "Meet me 8 p.m. Grosvenor House. Urgent." The implications struck us all immediately. Here was concrete evidence linking Blackwood to the victim, suggesting a prearranged meeting that could explain both Thornley's presence and Blackwood's nervous behavior throughout the evening. Inspector Bradley's expression hardened with the conviction of a man seeing his case solidify before his eyes. "It fits rather neatly, doesn't it?" Bradley said, consulting his notebook with professional satisfaction. "Blackwood's been making risky investments lately, nothing criminal but enough to make him vulnerable to blackmail. His nervousness last evening, the glances toward the garden, that business about stepping outside to meet a messenger, it all makes sense now." I found myself nodding in agreement, for the evidence did indeed seem to point conclusively toward the financial advisor. The business card provided the missing link between victim and suspect, while Blackwood's behavior had been suspicious from the beginning. His alibi, while technically sound, possessed that quality of over-preparation that often betrays guilt rather than innocence. Yet even as Bradley outlined his theory with growing confidence, I noticed Poirot's expression remained thoughtful rather than convinced. His head tilted at that characteristic angle indicating deep contemplation, and his fingers drummed silently against his lips in the gesture I knew preceded his most penetrating observations. "Inspector," Poirot said finally, his voice carrying that note of gentle disagreement that often preceded his most devastating revelations, "your logic is admirable, and the evidence appears compelling. Yet I must ask, why would a blackmailer, or indeed anyone arranging a clandestine meeting, carry the very evidence that links him to his intended victim?" Bradley's confident expression faltered slightly. Perhaps he forgot it was there, or intended to dispose of it after the meeting. Perhaps, Poirot conceded, though his tone suggested he found this explanation less than satisfactory. Yet consider, mon ami, the theatrical nature of this crime. The 3 knocks, the cryptic message about debts and buried secrets, the precision of the wound, these elements suggest a mind far more elaborate than simple desperation would produce. He moved to the window, gazing out at the garden where shadows were beginning to lengthen with the afternoon's advance. "No, I believe we are meant to find Monsieur Blackwood guilty. The evidence, she is too convenient, too perfectly arranged. Someone has been very clever in creating this tableau. But perhaps, how do you say, too clever by half." Lady Pemberton looked up from her chair with an expression mixing hope and confusion. "Then you believe Mr. Blackwood is innocent?" "I believe, madame, that we have found our first false lead, precisely as the true culprit intended." Poirot turned from the window with that slight smile that always preceded his most challenging pronouncements. "Someone wishes us to arrest Monsieur Blackwood," to close the case with satisfaction, and to look no further into matters that perhaps run far deeper than simple blackmail. Inspector Bradley, to his credit, listened to this assessment with professional attention despite his obvious disappointment. "Then what do you suggest, Monsieur Poirot?" "I suggest, mon ami, that we have only begun to understand the true complexity of this affair." The stranger knocked thrice, but I suspect those 3 knocks were merely the opening notes of a far more elaborate composition. Poirot's eyes held that gleam of intellectual excitement that always appeared when he sensed the presence of a truly worthy adversary. Someone has orchestrated these events with considerable skill and patience. Now we must discover who among our cast of characters possesses such deadly theatrical flair. As the afternoon shadows continued their inexorable advance across Lady Pemberton's elegant study, I realized that what had seemed like a straightforward case of blackmail and murder was revealing itself as something far more complex and dangerous. The evidence against Blackwood, while compelling, was perhaps too perfect, the calling card of a mind that thought several moves ahead and understood exactly how to manipulate both evidence and investigators. The game was indeed becoming more intricate with each passing hour, and I found myself both anticipating and dreading the moment when Poirot would finally reveal the true pattern hidden beneath these carefully constructed deceptions. The afternoon light had taken on that peculiar quality of approaching winter when Poirot requested that we continue our examination of Lady Pemberton's study with fresh eyes. As we prepared to descend from the guest room, Miss Ashford appeared at the landing, her arms laden with correspondence that she clutched with unusual protectiveness. Her typically composed demeanor showed subtle signs of strain, and when she noticed our small procession, a flash of something resembling alarm crossed her features before her professional mask reasserted itself. "Miss Ashford," Poirot called gently, his tone carrying that deceptive casualness that often preceded his most penetrating observations. "Your secretarial duties must provide you with intimate knowledge of this household's rhythms. Tell me, what was the usual procedure when preparing the guest room for Professor Crane?" Her response came with practiced efficiency, yet I detected a slight hesitation that had not been present during her morning interview. "The guest rooms are prepared according to Lady Pemberton's specific instructions. Personal preferences are noted and accommodated. For Professor Crane, I personally ensured the writing desk was properly supplied with paper, ink, and—" She stopped abruptly, her face paling as the implication struck her with visible force. "Ah, oui, mademoiselle. The letter opener that proved so conveniently at hand for our murderer." Poirot's gentle tone carried no accusation, yet the significance was unmistakable. Most thoughtful preparation. And who else was aware of these specific arrangements? As Miss Ashford explained that the entire household staff had been informed at their weekly meeting, I noticed her gaze drift involuntarily toward the correspondence she held. The gesture lasted perhaps only a second, yet it carried the weight of unspoken knowledge that Poirot immediately detected with his characteristic precision. "The letters you carry, Miss Ashford. Routine household matters, no doubt." His question seemed innocuous, yet the secretary's reaction was immediate and telling. Her hands tightened perceptibly on the cream-colored papers, and for a moment I thought she might refuse to answer entirely. Before she could respond, Lady Pemberton appeared at the top of the stairs with that silent efficiency that had characterized her movements throughout this affair. "Miss Ashford is handling private family matters that have no bearing on last evening's tragedy," she declared with surprising sharpness, her voice cutting across the conversation like a blade. The tension that followed was palpable. Inspector Bradley's expression suggested he was weighing the diplomatic complexities of challenging a woman of Lady Pemberton's social standing, while Miss Ashford remained frozen between competing loyalties. It was Poirot who broke the impasse with characteristic diplomacy. "Naturellement, Lady Pemberton. Yet perhaps Miss Ashford could confirm whether any correspondence relates to Dover, or to shipping concerns, or to gentlemen who might travel from that port to London." The effect was electric. Miss Ashford's face went completely white, while Lady Pemberton's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly. The letters scattered from the secretary's suddenly nerveless fingers, falling to the carpet in a cascade that seemed to carry the weight of hidden secrets. Returning to the study, Poirot moved immediately to the writing desk, where the crystal bottle of lavender water still sat with its stopper slightly askew. Using his handkerchief, he lifted it carefully, noting the faint ring on the blotter where it had rested, and a minute smear consistent with oil transferred by hurried hands. "The lavender is not the perfume of sentiment, Hastings," he observed quietly. "It is the perfume of concealment. One does not take such care to mask odors unless one knows that another nose is sharp. Perhaps the nose of a faithful secretary who notices when things are not quite as they should be." Professor Crane, who had joined us with an expression of grave concern, spoke with unexpected directness. "Lady Pemberton, if this matter relates to archaeological artifacts or their provenance, I may be able to provide context. The antiquities trade casts many shadows, and secrets have a way of demanding their due." His words seemed to provide Lady Pemberton with the opening she needed. Settling into her chair with the resignation of someone who has carried a burden too long, she began her explanation. "Gentlemen, I fear I have not been entirely truthful about my connection to Mr. Thornley. There was indeed a debt, though not of the monetary kind you might assume." As she spoke of her late husband's business dealings 20 years past, arrangements that required discretion and the cooperation of individuals in positions of trust, Poirot made an unexpected request that would prove crucial to our understanding. "If you would indulge me in a small experiment," he said, producing his pocket watch. "I should like each of you to reproduce the 3 knocks as you remember them from last evening. Not with force, but with the precision of rhythm you recall." One by one they attempted the sequence. Sir Reginald's effort was too brisk, Mrs. Fairfax too hurried, Dr. Whitmore too slow. Miss Ashford came closer, measured and deliberate, but the intervals were shortened by nervousness. When Professor Crane's turn came, he executed the sequence with uncanny precision, each knock separated by exactly 5 seconds, the sound carrying through the house with the same sinister quality we had experienced the night before. Poirot's eyes shone with satisfaction, though he merely nodded and made no immediate comment. "Most interesting," he remarked as we returned to the morning room, "how memory chooses what to preserve and what to discard. Precision may be born of habit or of rehearsal." It was then that Morrison appeared with the afternoon post, including a telegram for Inspector Bradley and a single envelope addressed to Lady Pemberton in elegant script. Bradley's telegram revealed that Thornley had arranged a September meeting with someone signing only as AC, initials that caused every eye to turn toward Professor Crane. But it was the envelope that transformed our investigation entirely. Lady Pemberton opened it with trembling fingers and withdrew a single card bearing 2 Roman numerals in stark black ink, Tattoo. The silence that followed seemed to stretch beyond its actual duration. Inspector Bradley sprang into action, dispatching constables to search the grounds, but no messenger was found. The card had been delivered with the same mysterious efficiency as the previous evening's deadly visitor. Poirot alone remained composed, studying the card with clinical interest. "So," he murmured, his voice carrying that note of intellectual excitement that appeared when he sensed a worthy adversary, "the interval continues. We are no longer merely investigating what has happened, Hastings. We are being informed what will happen." The implications were chilling. Someone was orchestrating these events with theatrical precision, counting down toward some final, terrible climax. The stranger's 3 knocks had been merely the opening movement of a deadly symphony, and we were all unwilling players amid a drama whose conclusion remained hidden in the shadows of buried secrets and long-delayed justice. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Lady Pemberton's elegant study, I realized that the true complexity of this affair was only beginning to reveal itself. The game had entered a new and more dangerous phase, where the psychological pressure would intensify with each passing hour until someone's nerve finally failed, or until Poirot's methodical investigation could unmask the deadly puppet master who pulled the strings from behind the scenes. The card bearing the stark Roman numeral 2 lay between us like a challenge thrown down by an invisible adversary, and the silence that followed its discovery seemed to press against the very walls of Grosvenor House. Inspector Bradley's immediate response was characteristically thorough. Constables were dispatched to search the grounds, the perimeter was expanded, and orders given that no one should leave the premises without explicit permission. Yet even as these practical measures unfolded around us, I could sense that Poirot's attention had shifted to a different plane entirely.